Hello and welcome. It's been about 2 years that I recorded the tutorial with Joel Gingeler, and I'm happy to have you back in the studio. Hi, Joel.
Hi, Mark. Happy to be here.
Happy to have you back. It's been 2 years when we did this tutorial, which has ever since inspired a lot of people about your technique, about long time exposure. What has happened in the last 2 years?
Well, actually, not so much has happened, apart from the fact that I've been winning some more awards. Basically, I'm still creating the same pictures with long exposure photography, with black and white, and still more focus on architectural photography. But some things has changed, and that's basically, more or less the workflow side of mine that has changed. I've tried to speed up my workflow, and at the same time, you can also see, if you look at my pictures from let's say the last 2 years, that I've tried to include a lot of shadows in my architecture photographs. Well, the thing is, if you, I like minimalistic photographs, and well, it's very easy to create minimalistic seascapes, for example. I mean, you only have a bridge, or you have just a pier or a jetty. But if you want to create minimalistic long exposure architecture photographs, let's say from the New York City skyline or from a building in New York City, it's so much more difficult to create something that's, that resembles minimalism. I mean, there's always the visual noise in an urban environment with all the buildings, with the traffic, with the people, etc. So how can you create a minimalistic looking image in an urban setting? Well,
it's very crowded, yeah, by definition almost.
It's always crowded, yeah, but still it's possible. And the way I do that is by including a lot of shadows in my photographs. So, that idea is basically derived from the famous architect Louis Kahn. He said something about shadows. What he said was, okay, basically shadows define a shape of a building. At the same time, they create mystery, and they evoke awe, and they also create silence. You see, so, and with that in mind, I've been trying to use the shadows in a more, emphatic way in my pictures. And at the same time, removing all the visual noise that you would see in an urban environment, and at the same time, creating a sense of silence and mystery. And if you remove all the visual noise, for example, if you would shoot the Empire State Building, and you would remove all the surrounding buildings or the surrounding environment, like the trees, the people, and the traffic lights, etc., in a very natural way, just by using all those shadows, you create so much, first of all, you create some mystery, but at the same time, you can create the silence that's needed, because shadows create silence. So that's one of the basic ideas that's behind all my architecture photographs from the last 2 years.
How does it relate to the concept of negative space, I think you called it in your first tutorial?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you would use shadows in an urban setting, I mean, you can't see anything. Well, you can see something, but you have to look very closely at it. Then you still see all those trees and all those people and the traffic lights. But it's non-distracting, because they're quite dark, and the first visual impression that people would have, okay, I'm not seeing anything there. I'm just seeing the Empire State Building, for example, or the Gehry Building. So basically what you do then is, especially if you would also have a darker sky, so the shadows from, let's say, the ground floor would merge seamlessly with the sky. So basically what you have then is a lot of negative space.
Okay, now you mentioned using more and more shadows, but you mentioned also, and this is the reason why you're here today, that your workflow has changed to a more speed workflow, as we call it. How did that come about, and what is it about?
Well, the thing is, if you would look at my older workflow, my ISGM workflow, it's basically focused on the creation of hard selections, you know, and that's quite time-consuming, because what I always wanted to do in my photographs, and basically those are also the essential of any photograph. You always have two things in any photograph, whether this is a color photograph or a black and white photograph. You always have shapes, you always have light. Well, you also have color, but color basically is the same as light. So there are always two things, shapes and light, and I want to control both of them. Well, with my older workflow, the ISGM workflow, I can control shapes just by creating hard selections. So I can isolate a specific part of a building or a complete building, so I control that specific shape. I could also control light with my ISGM workflow, but it's always limited. I mean, it's always possible to have more control over light just by creating more hard selection and more detailed selection, but that can be quite time consuming, especially if you try to, let's say, impact a specific amorphous shape. So I've been thinking about that, and I already knew that there was already a technique invented by Tony Kuiper. It's called luminosity masking, and that the luminosity masking technique is based on the light intensity of pixels. So I've been trying to integrate that part, luminosity mask selection, into my workflow, so I can also control light. So I've done that, and so the advantage of doing that is that I have more control over light. So, and I already had a lot of control over shapes, so basically I can control everything right now. And at the same time, it speeds up my workflow because another advantage is that I can reduce the amount of hard selections that I create. But most of the times I would still need one hard selection, maybe two hard selections, but the rest I can, by use of the luminosity mask, I can deduct and subtract and, and intersect all those selections with each other. So I can come up with a completely new selection, and that's quite that's quite fast.
Now you talked about workflow issues on the image editing side. How about your way of taking the pictures? Is that has that changed?
Not so much. One important difference with let's say 2 years ago is that I now exclusively use the tilt-shift lens. And by using that, I can basically create lots of panoramas and without a lot of correction in Photoshop. So I use the shift function quite a lot to completely capture a high rise in, for example, New York City, and create panoramas. But another creative and artistic advantage of doing that is that I now can combine normal exposures with long exposures in just one photograph, just by using the shift functionality from the tilt-shift lens. So that's something that I've been working on right now. So I haven't published any new photos yet with, let's say, the combined long exposure, normal exposure photos, but they are coming up, in a few weeks, I think. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
This brings us to the topic what you can expect of this tutorial. As he just said, the image taking part is more or less the same, except for the tilt-shift lenses, and you're still working on this. So what we're going to do is we'll include for you the films that we did in the first tutorial about how you are taking images of seascapes and architecture. Then Joel is going to go into the luminance mask-based speed workflow. So we're going to record after this interview here a set of new instructions for you, so you understand how to work with luminance masks and to speed up the workflow of creating long exposure photos. And at the end of the day, you promised me you would also give a little introduction of how to bring the speed workflow, the luminance mask-based workflow, together with the SGI workflow that you explained in the first tutorial.
I will do that. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so without much further ado, I leave the stage to Joel. And for you, in the meanwhile, while we set up your tutorials about luminance masks, have a look at the films about how he takes pictures, so you know how he creates the raw material for the editing workflow.